Hello, and welcome to this, the Savage Balance Podcast. Hey, hello everybody, and welcome to this episode number 30 of the Savage Balance Podcast. Welcome back, guys, from last week. Welcome to the second part of this sort of talk about mindfulness and our sort of current system and how they relate and how they join up together. Thanks very much for all the nice things you said about the first episode, and I bet there's, it's just not stopped flooding in. I've just been inundated with constant, continuous adoration and praise, and the thing is, it would now be a shame because you're listening to this a week later, but I'm recording this, 10 minutes after the first episode, so if you haven't done that, then I'm going to look kind of, a bit foolish, a bit silly, and I'd rather not, to be honest. So if you wouldn't mind making me seem, not arrogant or like just assuming praise, make it so that I've predicted the praise is there correctly rather than... Actually, I don't know if that feels worse now, does it? Just assuming that there's going to be praise. And then if there is praise, it's like a bit of a grandiose sense of self-worth there, isn't it? I don't know which is worse. Anyway... Just live. I hope you've lived a nice life for the past week, and if you haven't, I hope you can process it and, use that going forwards to, try and have a more content, authentic, peaceful, loving life. Anyway, waffling on. I do, before I jump into the proper, the proper stuff of this podcast, I want to sort of do a kind of announcement-y sort of thing. It's not really like It's not like a sort of announcement like you'd expect. Like, I'm not going to be like, I'm really sorry to tell you the Queen has passed away. That's the problem, isn't it? That's the problem when you're recording a podcast a week in advance, because she might pass away, and then this would be seen as being insensitive. And actually, it isn't. Like right now, it isn't being insensitive. I'm not being insensitive about the Queen. Like, it's a joke about projecting into the future, and if she hadn't, it'd be ha ha ha, that's fun, that's nice and funny. But if she has, then really it's a case of like going and cutting this all out, really, isn't it? Because of the implications of being rude. Anyway, it's not that sort of news. It's not global news. It's very personal news to this podcast. It's just a sort of announcement to do with stuff I'm doing. By the time you're listening to next week's episode, you'll be able to listen to all of the podcasts on YouTube as well. If that's an easier way for you to listen to this, then they'll all be there, and they will continue to be put there until, I'm overwhelmed by stress and have a breakdown and can't do it anymore, or just decide it's not worth it because people haven't been interested in it, or, all the myriad of reasons there could be. Anyway, there will be all the episodes available on YouTube. And there will be also our first ever sort of video interview where you can watch me and the participant talking. And I'm very excited for it next week because it is Blue Van Man, the wonderful sort of YouTuber who did, talks about food and football and all this sort of stuff. We had a chat based on a podcast I did a few ago. Like, I think it was episode 26? I think it was episode 26. Anyway, he got in touch through that. We recorded a podcast and it went a bloody treat, to be honest. It was wonderful and he was great company and it was just fun and enjoyable. So you can watch that on YouTube. You'll be able to see it physically on YouTube. You can also just listen to it here. It's, it's still good stuff. Like, it's a podcast, so you can, just walk around listening to it. You don't need to see our faces. But you can also have the option to see our faces, which would be wonderful. Hopefully the website will be more update as well. I'm hoping that everything will be up to date and I can go, hey, check this out and check this out and check this out and check this out. That's the plan. I've talked it up now. It now has to happen. So, look forward to that. Get excited for that. But let's jump into this podcast, shall we? As I mentioned before, like, it might be worth going back and listening to the first part of this as I really sort of go into depth about sort of a definition and talking about what mindfulness is, and sort of try to describe, what the zeitgeist is, what our current political, social, economic system is that makes up our kind of, what makes up the system in that sort of broad way. If you're not going to do that, or if you just can't remember, fine, all right, fine. If you're not going to do it, I'll just catch you up here, shall I? Make that whole first part redundant by just saying it in a minute. It's rude. It's pretty rude of you, to be honest, but if that's the way you want to play it, then fine, we'll go with it. So I sort of, described mindfulness. Basically, mindfulness is the process of placing your attention onto something, like bringing your attention and anchoring it into something for the purpose of, decreasing stress or increasing empathy and, that sort of thing. And I guess when I'm talking about our current system, I am referring to such ideas as sort of neoliberalism, consumer capitalism, globalisation. These are the sorts of things that make up our political, social and economic systems. And I guess I'm interested in what their relationship is to each other, because I think at first glance, for me personally anyway, they sort of seem a little bit in opposition. One, a sort of economically driven thought about, maximizing profits and such, and the other one, which is more of a deeper inner personal experience, which helps you reflect on the world outside. But it is true, like a lot of it's not just a meditation practice, especially in our Western society, and it's not a philosophical outlook either. It's not something to practice. Like, it's become an industry. Like, it's really part of this wellness industry, which is a huge industry. As I mentioned in the last podcast, in the USA, it's expected to be worth over $2 billion. So by 2022, that is, that's amazingly high. And that's not even wellness itself. Like, it's a multi-billion-dollar global industry. And like many major companies like Nike and Goldman Sachs and Google are bringing in and spending a lot of money in their resources and making space in the working day for people to have a mindfulness practice. So they do like workshops and courses and little events for their employees. So I just want to sort of explore that a little bit more. And I guess I'll start off by what I'm seeing is like that this current system is trying to incorporate its ideals and mold the mindfulness itself to fit that current agenda. And I describe that current agenda as sort of like the sort of pursuit of money first and foremost, like maximizing profits, turning people into consumers and like making them better workers, all of these sorts of ideas within that. So I think a good place to start is like saying, I think it's sort of generally accepted that a lot of these major companies will be saying, we're introducing a mindfulness practice because, we want to reduce as much stress on our employees as possible, make it a better place to work, make them happier in their work. Like, what's the problem? Like, where's there, like, why does there need to be any resistance to that? And, in that sense, as that question, that's a sort of fairly, that's a good question. It's a good question to ask. I guess I'm sort of thinking, like, if you're trying to create that in your employees, what is the cause of that? Like, when have you ever prioritized, when has, like, the economics and the pursuit of profit is normally first and foremost over sort of ethical implications of like making sure your employees are happy. I'm finding more and more in work that I've been involved in, but reading all of these sorts of things about all these different companies and stuff. So to what purpose are you investing in this? And I think like it's interesting because if you like in the last episode, we were talking about the benefits of a mindfulness practice. And that included things like, having increased focus day to day and better physical, mental health and like being a happier, more content, more resilient person. But if you break down those ideas, like, okay, so like, having better focus from a mindfulness practice on the one hand, it's going to help you digest conversations more and be more present with those sorts of conversations and be more present in your life and focus on the things you love and you enjoy. Equally, it can help you increase your attention at work and be a more productive employee because you're going to, get distracted less at work. And like mental and physical health as well. Like if you're encouraging the mental and physical health in somebody, that's wonderful for them. But it's going to reduce, people's days off from work where they're not able to work because they're ill. If they're feeling better in themselves, like decreased stress will create less inflammation, and less inflammation would in general mean that they have a better physical health. They're less likely to take days off. So it will reduce absenteeism within these companies as well. And when talking about, wanting to make employees more happy and more content and like more resilient to day-to-day life, I sort of think about, it as in like, is that an attempt to, because just before I get into that, like those other two, like it makes sense and that's a nice thing. If you want to make it sort of goes hand in hand, doesn't it? If you want to have people having less days off from, for being ill less, that's cool. And if you want them to, help increase their focus so they can, do more work, that's cool as well. There's even ideas you can bring into that which excite me, like the possibility of like a 4-day working week and things like that. That would be like a wonderful step in that direction if you can incorporate those things. But when thinking about the happier and more content and more resilient employee, like I think for a lot of people, work and just social issues in general have been sort of like ever decreasing more and more, and we're facing more and more difficulties with all of those things. Like in general, a lot of people tend to be paid less, but yet they're doing more work, like incorporating other people's jobs because of, redundancies and streamlining stuff. And it's not just that, but it's longer work hours as well to encourage that. But not just longer work hours within work, people taking work home a lot with them. So, we have our phones on us all the time. So a lot of people will be getting work emails, literally through the night. Like as they're going to bed, the phone goes off, they look at it, it's like, oh, it's my boss. They want this done by tomorrow when I come into work. And like, so you've got to go to sleep in that level of stress. So you're always in that kind of work mode. I've heard someone describe it before as if like a fine layer of dust has been layered throughout your whole life. Like it's an ever-present thing there. Like the first thing when you wake up, people go reach their phone and they check their emails and they've got to see what they're up to at work. So it's not just like the 9 to 5 experience and, more commonly like 9 to 6 or 7:30 to 7, like people increase it out. They're taking it home with them as well, like it's in their hands. And, it's harder to get mortgages and everything to do with inflation. Like it's stressful living in the 21st century and it's hard. And like my suspicion is that these companies are bringing in these sort of personal and really effectively quite cheap solutions to problems that they are creating, like social problems that they are creating by the ways that they are making us into not just employees but consumers as well and citizens in general, like the way that these companies make those environments. Like it's just even the idea of like making it all in the aid of making them better employees. It's like it's there to fit a certain agenda, and that agenda is maximizing profits, and maximizing profits at the expense of everything else is problematic, really. Like it's not I guess that's opinion. I guess some people could be asking, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with wanting to make better employees as well? If you're making them better by making them more physically strong and they're happier, like in their job, then why wouldn't you want to do that? And, again, a fair point. I think that's interesting. I think there's partly a few ways in which that could be the case. So firstly, I'd say partly in our current system, it's this sort of pursuit and glorification of work, like career over everything else, as mentioned in the last podcast. Like if you're a child, you're sort of being encouraged to know what you want to do with your life. And like it's an important thing. it's actually sort of like quite an important aspect of feminism as well. So career isn't like it's not necessarily a deadly or dangerous word, but I think the over pursuing it and seeing it like as top priority for some people to the extent where they will reject other important key issues as well, like social issues and like creating family and friends and network and time enjoying your, like pursuing your joys and stuff like that for the sake of really like, and when I say career, I guess I mean trying to maximize profit. Like a good career is a career where you might be earning, 50 grand upwards a year, but it doesn't, there's no prerequisite for what the job is. It's not making 50 grand a year doing what you love. It's making 50 grand a year, and the expectation is that's going to be a high responsibility job. It's a high pressure job, and it's probably going to be stressful. And in fact, maybe you're going to have to be sacrificing something for that level. Like you might be earning over 50 grand a year. So you should be, feeling the consequences of that. Maybe you shouldn't be having fun. Maybe you shouldn't be enjoying it. Like, I think that is sort of there in the zeitgeist. And I think that's a problem with wanting to create better employees, is you're emphasizing this idea of work as, one of the cornerstones of what it means to be a good, responsible human being. And secondly, I think there is also a kind of like class element to this as well. Because, it is good making this work better for employees, but there are a lot of people who are not going to receive that sort of treatment. Like, for example, like the workers at Amazon, they're not going to be, getting this kind of mindfulness treatment, or like various pub jobs I've had, low skilled work, for example. Like I think it's very much only being offered to white collar jobs, like quite prestigious jobs. And I guess that, that sort of encourages, like, that's a privilege, and, some privileges are okay, but like, I guess the point for me personally, with a privilege is you would want to, as much as you can, spread that privilege amongst as many people as possible. And I don't think that's the pursuit of these companies. Like, I don't think that, like, I don't know, for example, can't think of a company at the moment that comes to head, but if they're, prioritizing the people in the higher wage brackets to give them this kind of mindfulness outlook, but the lower end of that spectrum, the lower skilled and the lower paid of that, are not also accessing that. It's like sort of it almost defines that one person's job is more important than another, when really they're all part of a hierarchy of that work. And I think also the prerequisite for any job is like hard. Like I don't think low skilled work doesn't mean it's not hard work. Like I think people are working just as hard, 70, 80, potentially hours a week, at the bottom of the rung as you are at the top of the rung. It's just a different type of work and a different type of pressure and a different type of responsibility, but it's still hard work. And yet I think, like, at the moment at least, the people at the top end of that spectrum are having the privilege of having this as a potential option, and the other people are really just having to take the brunt of all of the things I said earlier, about longer hours at work, harder to get mortgages, harder to afford food, like, nurses, like having to use food banks and stuff, who are working nurses is a really peculiar outcome of what our society is at the moment. So I think in that way as well, again, all in the aid of making better employees, like there's a kind of divide in which some people are rewarded for it, some people aren't and don't get to access it. And really it should be open to all people in that sense. I think another potential problem with it is the results, it's partly the results of the work. There's an article that I read that I've linked to at the bottom, which, like, it's a really phenomenal article, and I would highly recommend you reading it in regards to this. Like, it was a lot of my thoughts and feelings going into approaching this, written in this thing. And like, for people who would understand a bit about what I'm talking, I think they would go, oh yeah, this guy must have heard of McMindfulness, How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality, the book by Ronald Purser. And I sort of had. It was somewhere in the back of my mind, but it wasn't until I started actually jumping into this. I was like, the book, the book that's talking about all the stuff that I'm trying to talk about now. Why didn't I try and get it? Why didn't I read it before I approached this? Anyway, I didn't. But he did a really, I'm sure there's lots of great stuff out there with him. But anyway, there's a really good article in which he articulates a lot of these thoughts and feelings really well. And so I've pulled a few quotes from things at certain points. And in regards to, the results of the work, there's a bit in which he says they're trying to make the workers work with a little more concentration and focus at Google, for example, to produce weapons of mass distraction. The aim of mindfulness at Google is that workers become less distracted in order to produce more distracting products. So, what I mean by the results of the work and that quote is that, okay, they may be, having a better, healthier, happier employees, which there's nothing wrong with that per se, but they are doing work and jobs which is having the inverse effect, like a negative effect on the world outside of that job. So for Google example, you're creating technologies that are designed to distract people, and yet you're emphasizing the importance for mindfulness for your employees. I guess but feels like a way of acknowledging and accepting what you're trying to do is take people's attention, but you understand the importance of having that attention, having that focus, because you need your employees to have it. Otherwise, if you were totally endorsing your own brand and what you would do, then why not just encourage the same lifestyles and worlds that, the consumers of the product will be having as the employees? But there's a disjunct, they're treated differently. We need you to be as focused as possible so you can create the technologies that will distract as many people as possible, because the more they are distracted by our product and use our services, the more, information that we can get on them, the more that we can sell that for advertising revenue, the more that we can increase our profits, basically. That is the point of it. So I think in those ways you can say there are arguments against having, healthier employees to fit a narrative and agenda that already exists. Essentially, I think it's a case of seeing people like both employees and citizens as secondary to profit, regardless of the consequences. And in fact, actually, I wouldn't say regardless of the consequences, I'd say fully understanding and seeking those consequences. That is what they're seeking. That is the intention, is encouraging addictive tendencies within people, making them hooked to their brand, to increase their wealth. While, the rest of the people suffer as a result of that. You can soon start to sort of pick apart it and see why, the idea of bringing mindfulness into the corporate world is dangerous. It can be quite dangerous. Another way in which I want to talk about mindfulness and the way it's incorporated into our system is this sort of stripping mindfulness from its sort of ancient, spiritual, kind of religious roots. One of Purser's criticisms of appropriating this Buddhist technique is that it's been seen that it has been decontextualized from its spiritual and conceptual framework, as in, mindfulness comes from the Eightfold Noble Path. And in fact, there's a really good quote, which I'm going to read out again from Purser, from this article that, again, do go and read because it's really good quality. He says, in the Eightfold Noble Path, there are 3 sections: ethical intent or moral virtue, meditation, and thirdly, wisdom. So here, with the way mindfulness is being used in the West, we put aside ethics and wisdom, and from meditation, we've taken a very tiny part of that, something Buddhists call right mindfulness. Meditation is not just mindfulness and breathing and paying attention to sensations. That is the very thin end of a big wedge. My understanding of Buddhism is fairly slight, but I've always seen it as something that is anti-ego, or at least in pursuit of self-negation and liberation from the trappings of ego. Purser jokes that the self-centered nature of mindfulness's Western incarnation should lead to it being renamed mefulness or myfulness. So you can see from that quote that like the ideas of like moral virtue and wisdom being taken out and stripped from that sort of aspect of it, like, and these are deeply entrenched in the practice itself. But once you remove those and you're using it specifically as a tool to, you know, create better employees, to create, you know, like more focused and like higher performing employees, then you're really, you know, you're taking out a huge point and a huge purpose of what the reason is that it's been built for. Like, I think a good way to actually approach this is actually sort of my experience using the app Headspace, for example. Now, I've got positives and negatives to say about it, and I do use it, and I've never had a problem with it per se. Like, it's been a useful tool for me, and it's helped me out. But it's, you know, firstly, it's an app that I pay for, like it's a subscription, and I can't remember the price, but it's expensive. Like, it can be expensive. And not only that, it's very much stripped from spiritual roots. So it's open for lots of people. And in many ways, that's a good thing. Like, you can be an atheist and listen to this and get the full benefits of it without it being any kind of a problem. Like, and you can be very spiritual and listen to it in the same way. Like, it's not really like it's open for everybody. But like the idea of firstly of paying for it, of paying for a practice that is by its very nature like focusing on the breath and just being guided that way. Like one example of why that can be a good thing is I've heard the Happy Pair talking about their courses. They do like a bunch of health courses, like happy gut courses and happy heart, you know, to encourage health. And they said that when they first started a lot of these courses, they would run it for free. And what they found is that people, because it was a free course, people tend to like trail off from it from the end and think, well, it's only free. I'm not losing anything if I have this X, Y, and Z, this piece of unhealthy food, for example, you know. And they found like the more, not the more that they charge, but when they found the right amount that they were happy to charge with it and people put in enough money, like if it was enough that was just over what was comfortable, they found that people were then, that was an extra motivation for them to actually do it. So if it was like, oh, I've spent £100 on this course, like I can't just fuck about with it. I've got to take it seriously. I've got to do it. And the results are better because of that, which is what they say. And like, it's hard, isn't it, to argue with that logic? Like, that makes intuitive sense. And like that's, it's sort of built into the sort of model of Headspace, isn't it? A bit like if you keep paying for it, especially like I paid for a year in advance, it'd be a bit cheaper, but like still, I can't remember, it's like 70 or 80 pounds, I think, for to meditate. And it's like, so if I don't use it for a while, there's something in the back of my head that's going, God, like that's a bit of a waste of money if you're not going to do it. So in one way, that pushes you back into it. But on the other hand, like that way of approaching it, and also things like, you know, it has a count meter. So every time you meditate within a sort of 48-hour period, I think, you know, it counts you up to go, how many times you meditated? 1. And then you do it again, 2, 3, 4, 5. And, you know, it keeps going until you miss a 48-hour period. And then it just, you know, completely goes back to zero. You could be on 242 and it just goes back to zero because you missed that day. And so like that sort of jeopardy, again, like that encouraged me to do, I think the most I did was 96 days in a row, I think. It was 4 days off 100 and I missed it out. But like, so it made me meditate for 96 days in a row, which again, like that's like you got the motivation of the money and you got the motivation of that. Like that's a good thing, right? Because it meant you were doing the practice that you wanted to do, that you were investing that time in yourself. And so partly, yes, it helped me stay motivated to a sense, but it also, like that counter sort of made it competitive. Like it made me approach it, I think, from not the right, well, headspace. Sorry it had to come up at some point, didn't it? That's why they called it that, because people say it. So I'm sorry, but I said it. Like my headspace at that point, when using headspace, didn't feel right. Like it wasn't the right environment to approach it with. Like it made me competitive. It made me like come at it from a comparative way. Like I hope I'm doing better than other people at it. And like, oh, here's proof that I'm really good for other people that I'm meditating. Because it says it here, it's 96. Like I've had long stretches of meditating at other times, but there wasn't a count meter, so I couldn't tell you how much. At the moment, my meditation practice, like I don't have that high motivation, so it tends to be in and out, flowing in and out, sometimes a few times for a while, and then sometimes not for a while. Like it tends to be a few times a week, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. It's not daily like I would ideally like to be reaching for. But I like coming at it from a competitive place and coming at it from like a place of, going, I've paid for this, so I have to, and I should, like, it's almost like just ticking a box, and it wasn't giving me the full experience of what I should be going to do when I go and sit down to meditate. And also, like, people might also say, in terms of the money I mentioned earlier, that like if it's an app and people are being paid to do it and like it takes a lot and it's such a big success, like they've got to cover their costs, So should we be paying to fund that? Like, should we be paying to fund the costs? A lot of people say, yeah, you got to fund the costs of running it. But when you look at like Headspace's revenue, which is estimated at roughly $50 million a year, and the company is valued at $250 million, this was in 2019, you sort of think, am I just covering the costs, or am I actually lining the pockets of somebody else for what is essentially like ancient wisdom like buried in other traditions, which is free and was always passed on freely and meant it was accessible to all? Because that's another thing about this, you charge 80 quid for a year's subscription. Not everyone's going to be able to afford 80 quid for a year's subscription. In fact, when I did it, it was sort of like pushing. It was like, make it count, make it worth it. So there's that class element as well. It's like it's not universal anymore if you're charging for it in that sense, because just by the nature of charging for it, like some people aren't going to be able to afford that money. So, it brings up all these sorts of questions. And I guess like it refers back to this sort of, there's also like this sort of stripping of its sort of spiritual and religious roots. I sort of feel like with that sense, you're running the risk of removing that original intent from it. So like with the Headspace, I was coming at it because like from a competitive point of view, or just ticking the box, or like going, I guess I should be brushing my teeth. It wasn't creating the right environment for me to do it. So I'm worried about this sort of mindfulness industry that we have, that we are removing the original intent, what it's from, which in that quote earlier, as part of the eightfold noble path, ethical intent, moral virtue, wisdom, that these were attributed to the ideas of mindfulness and meditation. And yet the removal of that means that we're practicing it in a different space. So we're developing something, the idea of developing something for the current age isn't in itself a bad thing. Like it's good in many ways, to take things from different places and, make, a lot of the best art has come from that, and film and like new ideas, like we share things from different cultures and we make new things together, and then like that's how we expand as a human race. And there's a lot of great technologies and stuff that have come from that as well. But I just worry you're making mindfulness a shell of what it was once before. Like it's decontextualized in a world that sees our planet as a commodity, that sees us as workers and consumers primarily. Like this is the way it's been altered, if you understand what I'm saying. Like it's okay to adopt things for a new world, like, if there's not many Buddhists in the UK, then maybe we should adapt this practice to incorporate more people, because it's not about turning people into Buddhists. It's a practice that's supposed to help people become more intent and become more authentic and more grounded and rooted and peaceful. and happier. Like, these are the intentions of it. It's not about making people into Buddhists as such. So, it's been decontextualized. If it's been decontextualized in that world per se, where's the harm and problem with that necessarily? But if it's been decontextualized in a world, again, that sees us as workers and consumers, that sees us, it's promoting competition through commodity, that encourages, and celebrates wealth and power. And I mean, like, monetary wealth and power. And sees the planet as a commodity. Like, is this the sort of environment that we want to see this practice being redeveloped in? And I don't think that's right. Like, if you remove the fundamental truths from it, then, it's like the current society doesn't endorse it. And it's just, that's my fear. Like, it's not so much about making sure everyone's doing it completely according to scripture. And like, I don't really define myself or identify in any kind of religious or spiritual kind of understanding, even from like atheist to religious, like I pick up ideas and I try to move and I try to understand it. I try to process it. And if you asked me how I would identify, I don't think I could tell you in words, because I don't really understand myself how to explain it. So it's not a case of just saying, do it how it was said in the ancient times. I understand a need for it to progress and to move on and to change. But you just run the risk of removing a lot of the important stuff from it. Like, you run the risk of removing a lot of what's needed. And I think part of like this sort of removal of spirituality from it is another aspect of our society, which for the most part, in almost all the ways, is a great thing, which is sort of the development in science, really. Now, I just want to preface this by saying, like, I'm not anti-science. I love science. Like, my late teenagerhoods into my early 20s were like heavily atheist, and I still there's a lot of principles that are still there in my head. Maybe things have been expanded upon, and I feel like more things have come in rather than a different shift. But I do have slight concerns with the overly scientific culture we live in, like the way in which mindfulness has been legitimized is through, making it sort of like it has to have been grounded and based in pure scientific evidence-based backing. And then in that case, we go, oh, these Buddhists are doing this thing. But if we just take the practice and remove it from the original place, we can see from the science that actually there's really good benefits to doing this. And so now, because of that, because we've got to that place, now you can practice this version of it, which is completely devoid of its spiritual intentions. And in a sense, there's nothing wrong with that in one way. But I'm suspicious that, purely trying to define things through the scientific evidence-based piece, where it's useful, it's useful in lots of ways, but I don't think it covers all ways. Do you know what I mean? It's good to know from a vaccination point of view from COVID-19 that they've developed vaccines that help, inoculate you from the dangers of coronavirus and COVID-19. That's a great thing. That's a great use of science. But also, science isn't really it's a useful tool to be part of the conversation, but it's not the whole defining attribute of, things like grief and love. Defining love purely scientifically misses out on the physical feelings of it. It's hard to explain, actually, isn't it? It's really hard when you start getting into it. Because it's not a denial of how our hormones react and how, we might pick up on scent glands or the physical attributes of somebody and how that is attributed to sexual or romantic intent, and having things in common means we increase empathy. All of these things are related in science, but I think there's a feeling that at the moment, at least, at the very moment, I have a faith in science that it could potentially like describe all of the things that we experience. But at the moment, it's limited. At the moment, it can't. Like, for example, like the hard problem of consciousness. A lot of people call it the hard problem of consciousness because it's the difficulty in describing, like analyzing consciousness through matter, through how the physical material world we live in describes consciousness when consciousness is not like a physical material experience. It's experienced somewhere else. I mean, that the hard problem of consciousness is debatable amongst sort of neuroscientists and philosophers and all sorts of people. But like, I think it's an example, at least, that there's a different kind of experiential experience within our consciousness that isn't always described by science. And so if the only way to legitimize this practice is by mindfulness, that is to say, we've proven scientifically that it's fine. Like, are we removing the potential for the experiential goodness that we could be feeling from it? Like, not all experience, I think, should be only confirmed by scientific backing. You know, it's a tricky one, but like, I guess science is a sort of, unfortunately, it's like that is an industry as well, and like it requires funding to do any kind of research, and it requires backing from certain boards and governments, and like and where's that money coming from? You know, who's funding it? It's a tricky world. Like, if the only place you're getting the funding to do your experiment is on, you know, rotting teeth and sugary drinks is from Coca-Cola, because they're the only people who are willing to spend it. They're the people in charge of the money, so they have a potential say and an influence in the results and in the way the experiment's conducted, in the way it's shared, in the way it's sold to the world. And like, if you pull the plug and say, I'm not doing that, they can pull that money and take it somewhere else. So that in itself like compromises science and like sees science as potentially a tool for consumer capitalist, ideals. So it's tricky, you know, this whole thing, it's very muddy and it's very tricky and it's difficult to define it all. But I've got one last quote as well from Ronald Purser, who again, like, he wrote McMindfulness. I've got a link actually to McMindfulness for you to purchase it. I'm recommending a book basically without having ever read it because this guy's words seem really interesting. And if he's saying this, I don't think he's likely to be secretly racist in the middle, is he? Oh God, I hope he isn't. I didn't research if he was secretly racist. Anyway, this is one last quote from him. Mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques have been adopted by the US military to help soldiers deal with stress in conflict, with the endorsement of Kabat-Zinn. In anything but name, this combat-enhancing training, designed to make soldiers better at killing other people, better at staying focused on firing weapons in inordinary, stressful environments. More obviously, mindfulness has been adopted whole-scale in corporate America as a method to reduce the effects of workplace stress, to drive productivity and increase workers' capacity for working. By introducing corporate mindfulness training, Kabat-Zinn and other practitioners are helping big business to flog the worker hard with one hand and provide a salve for the welts with another. I find that really interesting and a really good summation of the sort of things I'm talking about. By the way, that name Kabat-Zinn is a name he is sort of referred to, I guess, as somebody who sort of introduced that sort of mindfulness-based stress reduction technique into the corporate world. I don't know enough about it. I didn't read, like, it was only mentioned a few times. And there's a lot of stuff in this podcast already, so I didn't mention him much, but he's involved in the story in some way. All of this, to me, essentially, like all of the things I've been talking about through the past 2 episodes, all of this is just proof to me of the rigidity and the refusal of our current commodity-based consumerist capitalism to change. Like, our systems are resistant to change. If it just won't accept, and if it won't accept, and it can't destroy the oncoming thing, whatever's coming towards it, it will adapt and it will repackage it and it will alter it and accommodate it to fit the pre-existing model, as long as the pre-existing model stays untouched. It's sort of what I started talking about initially, right at the beginning of the last episode, talking about plastics and talking about like how the system, like it just incorporates this change, but it makes sure that it stays untouched and unchallenged. And the more it can incorporate this change without affecting its bottom line, then it will. And to me, it's dangerous, because the model is about infinite growth on a finite planet. It's about treating people as consumers and sort of manipulating them by advertising to sort of want and need things that they don't need. And that continual pursuit of that is a way of like creating, you have to have that dissatisfaction to want to fix it with those things. So you are trying to create a dissatisfied population of a planet. And even, you know, all of these sort of consumer capitalist ideals, like it makes economic sense to basically exploit the poorest people in the world in, you know, different countries like Bangladesh and in China, you know, and even in places in the UK where people are used as slaves for certain things, and children mining for Carlton, I think that's what it's called, isn't it? The mineral that is available, like, is meant for smartphones and smart devices. You know, people picking cocoa and the difficulties in like sugar canes, like, and the links that Nestle has to all of those. Like, these are the values that a lot of this system is built on, and it makes sense economically to have those systems because it does maximize profits. But the devastation that's laid in its path is, you know, brutal, and it's destructive. And like, I just find it really fascinating when something that I think is like truly radical and can challenge that is accepted and incorporated into it. In fact, this, like, I'm going to do more podcasts like these, maybe not two-parters, but more on subjects like disability and on weight and veganism and autism, more on like environment and plastics, as I said about before. Even like, well, I guess I can talk about it now. Like, I'm not going to do one on the European Super League because it's a bit pointless now. But that one was particularly interesting to me because I found it interesting that the government were concerned in getting involved with, to me, what seemed like the inevitable conclusion of the kind of system that it had been promoting for decades. You know, free markets, eradication of tradition and history under the guise of progressivism, you know, removal of power from regular citizens, seeing institutions as commodities. Like, all of these things are inbuilt in what sort of would lead to building in football, a European Super League that would destroy competition and leave a lot of the smaller clubs that are like local havens to very small individual communities. Like, it could ruin them. Like, to me, that makes economic sense that they would do that at first, but the government was stepping in and sort of saying we need to fight for our national game. And I thought, it felt to me like, you're gonna miss out on the profits, because that is like the Premier League and football and sport is just like a huge money earner. Like, I think they're a lot of the clubs that the most highest earning clubs are worth, is it like 2 billion or like 2.5 billion or like maybe even 4.5 billion? I can't remember exactly. I think it's like 2.5 billion. But anyway, like, so there's lots of ways in which I want to talk about the rigidity and the refusal of our current system to change and accept change. I just find it interesting because mindfulness, I think, has the power to be that revolutionary kind of change, that transgressive, disruptive idea to the system. Like, it can help you, like, properly doing it, create new perspectives that, you know, don't fit into that mold, and help you notice the conditioning you experience in this system. Like I've always been trained, in a sense, in that it's always been in the background to consume and to buy things and to remember my, you know, look out for deals and to like value my career and be conscious of how much money I'm earning kind of as a status thing. And the more I practice meditation and mindfulness, I just see that these are concepts, and I don't have to buy into those concepts anymore. So it has the potential to be really disruptive. And I just think it helps you live the life you truly want to live, not the life that you feel you want to live because the culture has been telling you this is the sort of life that you should be striving for. So I just find it interesting, that the most powerful companies are adopting this technique, but in a way that doesn't challenge their sort of base interests, even though the practice itself can be, I think, fundamentally challenging to the system in itself. That's basically all I wanted to say, isn't it? That's all I wanted to say. How long did it take me to say it? It took me like fucking 2 hours. 2 hours waffling to basically say, practice mindfulness and hopefully you'll be happier and you won't be as, coerced by the system that you're in. That's basically it. That's what I'm saying. And it took me a good 2 hours nearly, maybe an hour and a half to say all of that. So there we go. Hey, thanks very much for listening, guys. I do genuinely, I want to talk about it through veganism and through autism and the environment and the use of plastics and all of those sorts of things. That content is coming soon. But next week, as I mentioned earlier, will be the Blue Van Man conversation where we talk about all kinds of silly stuff and kind of sort of serious-ish stuff as well. We touch on social media things. It's just a wonderful conversation, so you can check it on the YouTubes. That'd be cool if you do that anyway. Hey, thanks for listening, guys. Thanks very much for sticking with me these whole 2 parts. If you could share this kind of stuff with people, I'd really hugely appreciate it. I would love to expand this a bit so more people are listening. Not in a selfish, personal way, the more I get, the better. I want it to be like a community as much as I can. I understand it's me, it's one person and my thoughts talking into a microphone. But what I want to do is be a kind of vessel for many different ideas and many different interpretations. And the more of those ideas I can get, the more I can be a sort of spokesperson for them. I'm reading Sophie Hagen's book, Happy Fat, at the moment, talking about fatness and fat liberation. And I'm not somebody who's ever lived in that kind of a body, so I've never experienced those things before. And it's really interesting, and I want to talk about it. I want to be a voice that's there to sort of spreading these ideas in a positive way. So the more you can share it with people, I'm hoping the more people will get in touch and the more people I can communicate with, the more ideas I can share about, and the more I can just create a space for people to come and listen to hopefully a new idea that they hadn't had before. That's one of the reasons why I like it makes it hard to promote, basically. This is a hard podcast to promote because it's not like a vegan podcast, or it's not a mindfulness podcast, or it's not an economic podcast. It's one episode is that, and the next episode is that, and the next episode is feminism. The next episode is just having a laugh and having because that's equally as important as well, just enjoying creativity. And the next one's about pet ownership, and the next one's about building a house, and the next one's about what color is the sky, and then the next one's, you know what I mean? I like the idea of introducing new ideas to people and exploring them myself. So that's why it's really vital and important. If you can just tell people that this exists, I'd appreciate it a lot. If not, and maybe you could put out, if you don't want to use words, maybe you can use, if you don't want to say words, that's what I mean to say, then you can write words on the Instagram with Savage Balance Podcast is the thing you'd be tagging me in with it. You can also use pictures on there as well. Same with Twitter, but that's more focused on the words, and that would be savbaopod. That email address is savbaopod@gmail.com, and you can just, again, that's the place to go to give me longer form thoughts. Any of the places I mentioned anyway, but that's the place for longer form thoughts. And I will reply, and I will read it, and it will be very humbling and enjoyable and lovely. I would love an email from you. Got a website, savbaopod.com. Should be completely all good to go next week, properly updated, and there'll be some good stuff on there, and I'll talk to you about that more some other time. Subscribing is a good thing, and rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts would be great. The artwork is by the tremendous Dolly Gray, who is like doing just a whole ton of work for me, making, sort of revolutionizing the way I promote it and all the, like, just making everything look properly brilliant. So check, just thank them and give them, a really lovely warm thumbs up. And the music is by Danny Tonks, and he does great music, doesn't he? I'd love to have him making more and newer jingles, and maybe you can make me a kind of, I don't know, kind of pop record, like it's the Savage Balance podcast. It's the Savage Balance podcast. Was it about, I don't know, was it about lots of things? Oh my God, it's about so many things. He's not really talking about them in depth, though, because he's only skimming them and then he's fucking off somewhere else. This is why he's made the music. Anyway, support him. That'd be good. Thanks very much, guys. I've waffled too long. Just have a good week. Tune in for Blue Van Man. I'm excited about that. Talk about these ideas in this with other people and see if you agree with them or disagree with them. Just blah, 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 blah. There we go. Nice one, guys. Cheers. I will see you next week. Bye for now.